Welcome to Ordinary People's Extraordinary Stories. Today I've got a guest on. Now, I'm looking forward to this one. So without further ado, I'll bring him in. So, welcome Scott. Thank you for joining me.
It's great to meet you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
No, I'm looking forward to this. So Scott, if you can tell me when and where you were born, if you can describe to me what it was like where you grew up, the schools you went to, and the education that you received. So you have the floor.
Absolutely. So, yes, my name is Scott Allan, and I was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia. That is in Canada on the very, very, very East Coast. And I was born in 69, so that would make me about 54 years old, 55 this November. And looking back on my childhood, so I grew up in just on the other side of Halifax in a place called Dartmouth. And I had a great childhood, I think. When I look back on it, it was, I remember building forts in the back of my house. Always had friends over for birthday parties. So I think I had a somewhat of a regular childhood. I don't know. Everybody has a different story, I'm sure. But I had two, hardworking parents, and they worked very hard to raise my sister and I. And yeah, we did a lot of things as a family. My father was really into boating. He loved yachts, so small yachts. We didn't have like a 40-footer or anything like that. But I grew up on the ocean, so every summer we would spend our summers going out on the boat, going into boat races, picnics on islands, and things like that. So always had great memories of our summers, and the winters were a little bit harsh, of course, looking back. But hey, that's what snowball fights were for. So, and my school was, I went to just a regular elementary school, junior high school, and I was never. I always struggled with school, so I was not the. I wouldn't say like I wasn't the smartest kid in class, but I just really struggled with it because looking back, part of it was could have been with ADHD, could have been with other things, but I really excelled at things like English and philosophy and history. But when it came to mathematics and science, it was just never my strong point. Although eventually I did end up becoming an electrical engineer, so I had to get really good at mathematics and science. That's maybe more of the story later on. Yeah. But yeah, moving forward, I just, I started, let's see, always loved movies, reading books, still love books and movies. So that hasn't changed at all. And I knew when I was even just a little kid, like I was always coming up with stories, and then I started writing out the stories, and I was always reading Stephen King books and science fiction books. So I started getting all these ideas for characters, and eventually started writing when I was probably in elementary or junior high school. And I did that for many years, actually. I was as a, I guess, a practicing fiction author, which eventually led me into writing books and publishing them. Yes, but the journey was from here to there. There was a lot of things that happened in between, of course. I eventually went to a community college because after I was finished high school, I didn't have enough credits to graduate. Like I said, I wasn't a great student, but then again, a lot of the things a lot of the courses that they were offering in school didn't really interest me. Looking back, if they'd offered some other courses that I was more interested in, maybe I would have tried a little bit harder. But after getting out of high school, I ended up working a couple of years in some really hard construction jobs. And believe me, once you've been working outside in minus 20 weather, you realize you don't want to be doing that for the rest of your life. So I got the credits that I needed to go into college, and I managed to get in. I got a trade and I started working, and then I moved out to Victoria, BC, where a friend of mine, my best friend, was living out there. And after I graduated from college, I had a really hard time finding a job. So my friend said, "Why don't you come out here and check it out?" And I did. And within a week or two, I had like 3 or 4 jobs, So I love the West Coast. I love the East Coast, but I love the West Coast. It was an amazing place to live. I moved out there and I was about probably 20, I think I was about 22. And I spent about 10 years out there before I moved to Japan. And I've been living in Japan now for about 25 years. And yep, I still live here. So um, anyway, I'll just leave it at that. And maybe you have a follow-up question.
Well, actually, I don't have any questions at all because you've covered the whole of your life. in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Well, let's
There's a few
let's
things in between.
let's drag you a
Yeah,
little bit. Let's drag you back a bit. Now,
sure.
growing up, you mentioned a little bit about sailing. Now, I know a little bit about sailing, being a bit of a sailor myself. What size boat was your parents?
We had a few boats actually. So one of the boats that I do remember was a 20, I think it was a 27 or 28 footer. And I can't remember the kind of boat that it was, but it was big enough to sleep 5 or 6 people. And again, we weren't like a super rich family or anything. It wasn't like a massive yacht or anything like that. But I mean, my father just, any money that he did have, he put it into his number one we hobby, which was sailing. I don't know what he did in the winter, but in the summer we were always out on the boat. So he went through a few boats, but I remember like when I was really small, like around 4, 5, 6 years old. I still have photos of when I had my little life jacket on, and our boats were like, we started with like these 12 or 14 foot. They're like catamarans. They were just these smaller boats,
Yeah.
and then gradually, as I got older, the boats got longer. So maybe because they needed more space to fit us kids, right, and the couple of dogs that went with us as well. But there's
Mm.
nothing like one of my favorite songs, by the way, is "Sailing" by Christopher Cross. I just always love that song. So, because I think my father used to, back in the day when we had, I think it was like, we took a radio with us or a cassette player or something, and he was always playing music on the boat, and that was one of the songs that he always played. So every time I hear that song, I always think about sailing. Well, of course, the song is about sailing, but every time I hear the song, I think about the times I went out with my family on all those trips and everything. And we would spend weekends going from, like every weekend we go to, like during the summer, go to a different island. We would spend the night there. Sometimes we would camp right on the beach, and other times we just like stay on the boat. And we always had to tow a
Mm.
little rowboat behind us because we had to get, onto the island,
Yeah.
stuff like that. So I actually loved rowing too. That was one of my greatest. I mean, it's great exercise, but I used to row all the time when I was a kid, and I used to pack a bunch of kids into my rowboat and just row around the ocean. You know, so I just love water. Now the thing is, too, I may have mentioned I can't swim very well, so um, that was always a challenge. So I was always afraid of the water, but I love going out on the boats and doing things like that. And eventually, years later, I became a certified advanced scuba diver, even though I can't swim very well. So,
Well,
yeah,
that's all.
life,
That's all
life,
part of sailing, isn't it?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's that boats are for going on, not for going in, and
yeah,
I feel exactly the same. I mean, I'm not a great sailor, but I'm a great sailor, but I'm not a great swimmer. And I
yeah,
don't like going in because there's a lot of things that can bite and eat you in the water.
yeah. There is. Yeah, you've got the jib, you've got the mainsail, you've got the rudder and navigation, and
Yeah,
but I mean, if you're an experienced sailor like my father was, he just knew he knew where the core, he knew where the reefs were and the rocks,
yeah.
and he knew where the whales hung out and all that stuff. So
So you
yeah,
spent a
and
lot of time at anchor then. So you anchored off these places rather than going to marinas.
no, and well, yeah, we did, and we also went into marinas as well. In fact, we used to keep our boat at. We had like a few different marinas depending on because my parents moved around quite a bit, so depending on where we were moving to, we usually changed marinas as well. But yeah, we spent quite a bit of time in marinas. But when I was growing up, I'd say from the ages of like 12 to 17, we lived in a kind of like a secluded place that was on the ocean, and there were just like a few families living in this one area. And the thing is, like we would just drop a mooring in the ocean, and you just weigh it down with
Mm.
I think like concrete blocks, and that just became we basically had our own personal marina out front, right? So, well, I do remember though helping my father I think it was like every September we had to bring the boat in out of the ocean,
Yeah,
and yeah, that was
put it
that
to
was quite
bed.
the yeah, yeah,
Yeah, winter maintenance.
yeah,
I mean that's fairly common. Alice Uber the plats all over the place. So
yeah.
back to the areas you lived in then. So what was your sort of your first memories of your kindergarten and the area that you grew up there in?
Yeah, that's great. So here's kind of an interesting story. I went back to, well, I don't know if it's interesting, but tell it anyway. I went back to Canada um, in May of this year. It was my first time back in about 5 years before COVID. And when I went back with my partner, and I hadn't been back to my old neighborhood where I grew up, like where I went to kindergarten and I played on the streets with all my friends and everything. And I hadn't been back there for, you know, maybe 30 years. Now I've been back to Canada and visiting my parents, but they kind of moved around quite a bit, and just, my mother's only alive right now. So, but I've always had this. I always want to go back to my old neighborhoods and just kind of walk around and see if I can remember anything. So I did that with my partner, and we went back, and wow, it's just such a feeling of nostalgia when I went back there, because right away. It was almost like nothing had changed, right? It was like 1975 all over again, and I was 6 years old, and the houses were all the same color. My old house was still there. It was the same color. My father built the house, actually, and it was on this street that kind of there's like this main highway, and it's on this side street that kind of goes up, and at the top of it is a junior high and a high school. And our house was like one of the first houses that was built on that street. It was the first house on this street, actually. So when I went back there just a couple months ago, yeah, nothing had changed. And I thought, to me, that's great, like to go back to the place where you grew up and it all looks the same. It's like a dream. But when I was
Mm.
growing up there, yeah, like in my kindergarten days, I mean, I remember meeting my first friend on that street when I was 4 years old. And when I went back a couple months ago, I met my old friend as well. And we were talking about that, and we're both the same age, of course. So but I still remember to this day, like we just moved into my new house. The sod wasn't even put down on the front lawn yet. It was all dirt, and there's still a tractor in front where they were building, like planting the trees and stuff like that. So when I looked at the house there, we went back and visited. To me, like I could see the tree that I planted with my father at the time. It was 1 foot high. It was now like 40 feet high. It's still there, and
Yeah.
so it was just beautiful. I mean, I don't know. It's just, I live for nostalgia. I love going back and and so I had a couple of different places that we had lived in, and I went back to the other place that was near my elementary school as well. And same thing, everything looked the same. It looked a little bit older, as it would, but
Mm.
it's just great to, go back to, like your old school. Cause like for me, like I had these visions of myself, like I could almost feel myself as I was when I was little, when I went back there. So but yeah, we always always played outside with my friends, like I mentioned. And I think in the wintertime, there was quite a few hills where I lived as well. So the wintertime, we would take our toboggans up to the hill and have races going down these hills. And I remember on one hill in particular, there was like this big rock in the middle. So part of the game was you had to try and get as close to, and this hill was steep. So when you started moving, you started moving. And I remember this kind of this big rock in the center. And the game that we would play with our friends is to see, who could get the closest to this rock without hitting it, right? And I remember one day I actually got too close to it, and I ended up hitting it just like the Titanic hit the iceberg on the side. Well,
Yeah.
the toboggan hit that rock. And when it did, this new toboggan that I got for Christmas just split into like 20 pieces. And I didn't hit the rock, fortunately, like myself, but I went flying off. And, my parents weren't too happy because it was a Christmas present from Santa, and Santa had to go and buy me another toboggan. So, but it's interesting because
I
like
just,
I just remember that right now. Like I hadn't even thought about that until you started asking me about. And so like the more I kind of walk through things, I start remembering these
yeah.
these, well, God, I call them dreams, but it really did happen. So
That's what this is all about. It's all about
mm.
getting to know you and how you've grown up. So, move slightly on then. What about your elementary school? How, how'd you get on there?
Mm.
You said that you weren't all that good at the sciences, but other stuff you're okay.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I don't know. I think I just did my best in school, like a lot of kids. Now, um, I don't know. In school, like you always had the smart kids who are always like good at everything, like the math and the science, and they had like 90s and hundreds on the report card. And I never achieved that. And when I look back, like I think when I was in elementary school at the time, I had somewhere along the line, like I developed a belief that I couldn't achieve that. So maybe I never did. But when I look back, I realized, well, that's probably just my belief. Like if I could, like if you could go back in time, you change things. And I realized,
Yeah.
like, because actually, like years later, when I went into college, I had to do really well, because if I didn't make it through that, and get a skill, then I was going to be back in construction. And so I had proven to myself years later that, oh, I can actually do formulas, and doing this math stuff's actually fun. But going back to elementary school, though, like, honestly, when I think about my elementary school, it's not the courses, the studying, or anything like that I think about, or how little of it I did. It was the friends that I had there. I remember the teachers. Now, back in my day, and maybe yours too, I don't know, but I do remember, like, my in first or second grade. This is probably going back to 74, 75. If you got out of line, those are still back in the days where you got the ruler over the knuckles, and of course that would never happen today, right? I don't remember when they
Oh,
stopped doing that. But I do
perhaps you
remember
should.
that happening. Yeah, yeah. I don't think it ever happened to me, but I remember it happening to some of my other classmates. And it's interesting when you look back, in the like in that period, like it was the normal thing to do. If a kid, like we was, they would put kids in the corner, put a dunce cap on kids, and all these things
Yeah.
that kids would never experience these days. And thank God for it, right? But
I don't know.
I look
I
back.
don't know. I think a bit of caning might go down quite well nowadays, just to instill that little piece of discipline. I mean,
Right.
when I was at school, I got the cane half a dozen times, and a couple of things it taught me. One is don't get caught in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
but but, but yeah, don't do it again. That's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
the key is don't do it again. It
yeah,
sharpens the mind up a little bit.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. I was a little bit of a hellion too, though. I mean, so here's the thing, like, my friends and I, we were in elementary school. So I just moved into a new house, and again, we moved to a new area in, just outside of Halifax, not far from the house where I was born and grew up in. And once again, my father had like the first house on the street, right, surrounded by woods and everything, right? And so they were putting up all these other houses. Like, our house was built, and then they were building all these other houses on the street. And my friends and I, well, I came up with an idea. I was like, I'm going to build a fort in the back of my house, right? We had like a nice sized little backyard. It had all these trees. And so I actually went back there with a tape measure, and I found 4 trees. I think it was 3 trees, actually. So I built a triangle fort, right? And it was probably like, it was a big one. It's like 20 feet by, it was like big enough to sleep probably a whole classroom, right? But the thing is, we needed material, right? So I don't remember if I had suggested it or one of my friends, but one of my friends said, "Well, they're building houses all over the place. There's wood and nails everywhere," right? And he was right, because they would throw a lot of the wood that they were using. They'd throw all that out in the backyard of all the other houses. So the workmen, when they all went home at night, we went around to all these houses, and we would pick up all the wood and stuff and bring it back to my house, and we would be,
Yeah.
we'd find nails, stuff like that. And so we just did that for months. And I think my mother, and I think my I don't know if my father really noticed, but I think my mother, like, she said, like, I don't know where you're getting all this wood, but it better be free. So, in other words, you better not be stealing it, right? So I was like, it's
Mm.
junk. But I mean, within a couple of months, we had built this like 4-story fort in the back of my house. And I remember drawing up blueprints for it, and I was directing everyone on what to do and where to pound the nails. And we eventually some of these houses needed carpet. So they started putting carpet in. And, well, what did they do with the old carpet? They threw that outside too. So now we had a carpeted fort, right? The only thing we didn't have was power, but I think we had a couple of lanterns. But yeah, we ended up, once it was built, we ended up spending quite a few nights in that fort. Like, the whole summer, I think I'd have my friends over on the weekends, and we would just
Mm.
sleep in the fort. It was a little bit cold. It didn't have internal heating or anything like that. It was built out of 2x4s and plywood. So
Mm.
yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I was always into like building stuff and creating things, and always looking for the next project to work on. And I don't think that's changed very much with me now that I think about it. I still do these things. So I'm not building forts anymore, but I'm creating other things. So
Mm.
yeah.
So let's move on a little bit. Let's have a look at your high school.
Hmm.
how did you get on with high school?
Well, let's see. Can we go back to junior high school? Because I got something to
Yeah,
share with
yeah,
junior high school.
junior high.
All right, so I got into junior high school, and once again, so after my elementary school finished, we moved again. My parents, when I was talking to my aunt a while back, she was joking about how often my parents moved. I think we moved like 4 or 5 times because they always want to try out different houses. So we moved to another place way out in the country where it's like again, it's like on the ocean, had our boat out front, and so I ended up going to like a new junior high school, all new friends, didn't know anybody. Had to take the school bus to school every day, which was probably about a 25-minute drive, maybe 30 minutes. But,
Was
it would pick
that
us
one
up
of
right.
those big yellow buses that they have in
Yes.
America?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it
Yeah,
was one
same
of
in
those.
Canada
Yeah.
then.
Yeah. Yeah. I think they all look the same, don't they? Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, pick us up every morning. And so anyway, my junior high school, yeah, I kind of went to, I mean, again, like I met some of my greatest friends there, right? It's a little bit of a rough school too. Like, Um, I don't know. I got along with most people, but like there was a lot of kids like to like to solve something. They would probably just like have a fight about it, and I wasn't really much of a fighter, and I didn't want to be, but I ended up getting like beaten up a few times. So what ended up happening when I was probably about 15, 14 or 15, I thought I just watched the Karate Kid for the first time, and I thought I'm going to be like that. So I ended up taking karate for about 4 years. And once I
Bit of
did, uh,
wax on, wax off.
yeah, I don't know if we did much of that, but it was a pretty tough sport though. Looking back, like it was like for discipline, I couldn't think of anything better because my karate instructors were actually some of the like they were probably like the best of the best. Like one of the older instructors, he actually had pictures of him training in Okinawa with Bruce Lee, or anyway. But he was, so these guys were pretty hardcore, right? And they trained us really well. And again, I wasn't doing it to like win tournaments and fight back against the bullies, but I wanted to make sure that if I got cornered again in school, I wasn't going to get my ass kicked, which was basically happening, right? So anyway,
Yeah.
that kind of like gave me an edge in high school. But again, it's just like I just let people know like and I joined a few karate tournaments and stuff like that. So ended up growing a little bit bigger too because I was usually the smallest kid in class. I'm not the smallest, but I wasn't the biggest. I was definitely like
Mm.
I was shorter than most of them. And then when I hit probably 15, 16, I just kind of sprouted up. Didn't I'm not like 6'8". I was like maybe 6 feet, 6'1" maybe. So yeah. But anyway, yeah, like a junior high school was again I think that was the time when I think Atari was. I remember having an Atari video game center, and then I had a Commodore VIC 20. So I spent a lot of my weekends actually playing video games, and the VHS recorders had just first come out. So my parents, because we were living in a very isolated area, I didn't have a lot of friends. They felt kind of bad about that, so they went out and bought us like a computer and a VHS player to keep us busy, and it did. I loved those machines, so ended up watching a lot of movies on the weekends and everything. Yeah,
Mm.
but coming back to junior high school though, just with the studies again. I mean, I was never like an academic student, but I think a lot of that was really by choice. I didn't have a great attitude towards school, and I was interested in doing other things. So I go to school, do what I had to do just to get by. But then when I went home at night, I'd read books and I was writing and doing things like drawing and I think I was practicing guitar at the time. So doing things, the things that I really wanted to do, probably like a lot of kids, I did after school,
Mm.
so or on the weekends. So yeah. But my
So
junior high and my high school though, right?
what books were you into? What was
Oh,
your staple reading material?
yeah. I love reading Stephen King books. So I was always reading Stephen King, Dean Koontz for science fiction, Arthur C. Clarke for science fiction. I had a pile of like fiction books. So now, I mean, the books that I write and publish now are like self-help, personal development. But I did write fiction for a long time, and I am going to publish my fiction works eventually. But back in the day, like I just loved fiction. Like that was all I read. I didn't,
Mm.
didn't even know what a self-help book was. I don't think anybody did back in those days. So, but look, my favorite books though were like Stephen, like Christine, Pet Cemetery, The Stand, The Shining. Like I would read those books again and again and again. I loved ghost stories, right? And I still do. I love being scared, right? I know some people like they'll never watch a horror movie or a ghost story. You show me a good ghost story, and I like that's like that's to me that's a good way to spend 2 hours, right? So I used
Mm.
to watch really scary movies as well, like The Changeling and Friday the 13th, and could name like a Poltergeist and all those, But the books, especially, like yeah, I was reading those kinds of books, and then I was trying to come up with my own stories, and kind of like and
Mm.
I would watch Stephen King in interviews, and how he would come up with his stories, where he would just he'd just sit around, and he'd just get ideas, or he'd be walking down the street and he would get an idea like, oh, what if I met this crazy clown on the street and he tried to pull me away into the woods? And well, next thing you know, he's writing it, right? And he goes to stay at a hotel with his parents. And he's thinking, what if this hotel was haunted and there was like these two little girls were murdered in the hotel? And what if I started to see them? Next thing you know, he like The Shining and all these, like a lot of these books, came out of his imagination from just asking what if, right? So I
Mm.
started to do the same thing, like what if we went sailing and we got kidnapped by a bunch of pirates, and I started putting these stories together. So on one hand, I lived in, we'll call it reality, where I go to school, try to be try to be a good student, and play with my friends and stuff like that. On the other hand, I've got this part of me that lives in fantasy, where I'm making up these stories, and I want to write these stories down. I want to talk to people about them, and that was just like, and I'm probably not that much different these days, I think, because eventually I learned to take my dreams and turn it into a reality, more of a different story maybe for later. But I think a lot of that just came from when I was like, not just when I was growing up, but surrounded by like my role models were like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, actors like Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill, and can name like a million other movies that I grew up with. Like every time I would watch a movie, even if I was watching E.T., I would imagine myself as I'm Elliot and I'm taking care of E.T. Like I would actually go out and I would buy the soundtracks. I had the soundtracks for everything, and that was the music I listened to, right? My friends were listening to like Ozzy Osbourne and, and all this other rock music. And I'm listening to the soundtrack from Indiana Jones, right? Imagining myself as the hero in the story, like that was just my imagination, I think, running away, which I wanted it to do. So,
Mm. So let's try on a little bit. Let's have a look at your high school and your final year. What was that like?
hmm. So my high school. So when I went into high school, I think the transition from grade 9 to grade 10. Mm, Something started happening where I remember having a bad attitude in high school, actually, and I think I wanted to have one. Like I wanted to have this reputation of being like real badass, right? So I thought I'm going to show them just how naughty I can be. So I would start acting up in class, throwing spitballs and paper airplanes, and being at the back of the class making noises and things like that. But when I look back at it, I mean, I think part of it was me like I don't know, rebelling out against the fact that I found the work really hard. So I thought, if I can't do the work, I might as well like have some fun with it. But that didn't go over very well with any of the teachers, because most of them ended up hating me, of course. And back in those days, again, like I think I actually got into an altercation with a teacher. It was my math teacher, where one day he just lost it, and I remember him picking me up out of my chair, dragging me physically out of the classroom, and throwing me out into the hallway. So if you can imagine that happening today, right? But that did happen, right? And it was interesting, because when I went back to Canada a couple months ago, I met up with my old friend who was in that classroom on that day when that happened. He said, "Do you remember the day our math teacher like picked you up out of your chair and threw your books across the room? Literally threw my books across the room, said, 'That's it, you're out of here.'" And I think I think I was just laughing and joking around. I mean, but I think 6 months into that, he'd had enough of it. So
Mm.
didn't have a great reputation with the teachers in my school, but then again, I asked for it too. So,
Yeah.
but here's the thing too. Part of me wanted to be this, badass, where I was going to show everybody just how naughty I could really be. And on the other hand, I was actually a hard worker. Like I would work on the weekends, I would mow people's lawns, or in the winter, I would shovel snow. So I actually had a little side business going on where my friends were getting money from their parents. I was earning money from doing all this work in the summer and the winter, you know. So even though I didn't put a lot of my like effort into school, um, I put a lot of work into other things though, So it wasn't the fact that I was lazy. Again, I think I was just choosing where I wanted to put my energy. Now, again, if I had to go back in time, I probably would have put more energy into my studies, but hey, history is the
Mm.
history. But
Yeah.
here's the thing though, like forward, like I went from grade 10 to 11 to eventually 12. And, um, my attitude more or less stayed the same. It got a little better though when I got to high school. And when I got to high school, I ended up, I think I dropped karate and I joined the wrestling team. And I changed high schools as well. I went to a different high school because my parents moved again, moved to a new town, new marina for the boat, and I had a new high school and new school bus. Right, so I went to this different high school in grade 12, and again, new classes, new friends, and I ended up joining the wrestling team, and that was amazing because. The wrestling team was actually one of the best in the country. So I didn't realize it at the time when I joined it, right? And the thing is like because I had had a lot of experience with karate, throwing people around, and then I was also, by the way, and I started working out when I was like 16. So I remember buying a book that Arnold Schwarzenegger had put out, and Arnold's on the front cover, with
Yeah.
looking like this is like back in 1986, right? And I think Rocky Four had just come out, so I bought the soundtrack to Rocky Four. I had Arnold Schwarzenegger's book. I bought a weight set, and I turned my basement, against my father's wishes. I turned my basement into a gym. I had a heavy bag and a speed bag, and I had weights, and so I was always really physically active. So when I tried out for the wrestling team, even though I had no experience with wrestling, I got onto the team, right? And ended up going around to like around the whole province and had had a lot of wrestling matches. But again, like when it came to my academics, the teachers actually, when I went from grade 11 to grade 12, the teachers recommended that I go into the general programs, which is basically the programs that they put the kids who just they know are not going to make it. And the thing is, you had a choice. Now they told me if you go into the academic programs, they said you're not going to make it. Go to general, you might make it. And the thing is, I didn't like the fact that they were making that decision for me or trying to. So I said, no, I'm taking all the academic courses. Okay, so to hell with you guys, and this is what I'm doing. And I did it, and actually passed 5 out of 6 of my classes, but I was still short a couple of credits. Now, at the time, I had met a girl in my high school, and we started dating, and she was actually one of the smartest people in the whole school. She ended up getting a scholarship. She had the highest grades in the whole school, and she's hanging out with this guy who's like when it came to academics, he's at the bottom of the totem pole, but he's kicking ass on the high school the wrestling team. And so here I am with we're kind of like we were, I don't know if we were a mismatch, but people were asking her like, why him? Like, okay, he looks big and strong and stuff, but don't you think you want to go out with like the? So I don't know. It was just it was an interesting time, but we ended up going out for like 4 years anyway, and even after high school. The thing is, she ended up getting into a university. I couldn't get into anything because I didn't officially graduate, but I did put in 3 years, so I did. I was never held back in school either.
Mm.
But here's the thing: like once I got through high school, I didn't even, didn't have a graduation either because I didn't graduate. So I ended up going to her graduation. And once I got out of high school, I just decided, I'm just going to work for a couple of years and kind of figure out what I want to do. But what I knew I didn't want to do actually was go to school anymore. To be honest with you, I didn't really want to study, and I wanted to do other things. I just didn't want to spend 4 to 6 years in more classrooms.
Mm.
So after a couple of years of doing some like hard labor or working really hard, I did eventually go back to I got into a college which wasn't easy to get into. Again, it was a community college, but it was one of the best, and it was like the best in the province, and they had the best courses. And ended up taking an electrical engineering course, and that was like a 2 year course. So again, I had to get really good at mathematics and a little bit of science, but I realized that it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. And as far as my grade 10 math teacher picking me up and throwing me out of the classroom, well, you know, I showed him who's boss once I graduated from the course. So
Mm.
yeah, but anyway, yeah. So high school was like, I think like my junior high school was very different. High school was very different, and again, like I think for me, I was happy just to get through it. Now here's the thing too.
Mm.
Like I needed 2 more credits to actually get my high school diploma, right? So here's where it comes down to. I have a lot of motivation, right? I always have. I don't know if it's some motivation, but I have a lot of like perseverance and resilience. So I didn't just want to be a high school dropout. So I actually ended up taking through like basically through the postal service correspondence courses. So again, remember this is way back before the internet or anything like that. We didn't have e-courses, of course. We didn't even have computers. Well, we did, but not like now, right?
Mm.
So I ended up enrolling in like these like 4 or 5 or 6. I took like 6 or 8 of these correspondence courses. So basically, what they did, you sign up for the course. They sent you this textbook, and every textbook had these lessons in it. There's like 40 lessons, and you just did like a lesson. Well, you could do it at your own pace, right? So I would go through one of these courses in like 3 weeks, and every time you did, you got a credit, right? So I ended up getting like 18 or 19 credits for my high school, which is more than you need to get into anywhere. And I did better on these correspondence courses than I did in any class that I took in high school or junior high school, right? And getting like high 80s and 90s in for the course, and I was finishing them in like 4 to 6 weeks, right? Not taking it like in school. We took them for a year, right?
Yeah.
And I thought if I'd known about this before, I would have taken these a long time. But the thing is, the courses that I was taking through correspondence were mathematics. And by the way, in high school, I failed grade 10 mathematics twice in a row. Took it one year, failed it, and took it the second year. When I was in grade 11, I had to take grade 10 mathematics again. Same teacher, by the way, and he remembered me, and he's the same guy that threw me out. He's like, no, there's no hope for this kid. So, but when I took the correspondence courses, I just studied really hard. I aced it. And then I took physics and I took like chemistry, and I was taking these courses that if I had told anybody in high school that I was taking these courses, they would have laughed at me, right? But the thing is, when I started studying them, I actually liked it. I was like, I actually felt like I felt smart. I was like, oh, so this is what it feels like to be on the other side of the fence. Um, but the thing is, those courses is what I needed to get into the course that I want to take later on in college, right? So yeah. So you know what? When I look back, like it's like all the dots, like nothing. I mean, nothing was perfect, but it's like when I look at it back and connect all the dots from way back when I was a kid, from like building things, creating things,
Yeah.
reading hundreds of books, like making that my number one passion, wanting to be a writer, and then um, even though I didn't get through high school, I had the perseverance and the resilience to like I wasn't going to fail. I was just like, I'm going to make it doing something, but I'm not going to allow anybody else to decide what that is. So yeah, but anyway, yeah. Sorry, that's probably a lot to unpack, but
Yeah. So let's so you've done a bit of manual labour and stuff like that, and then you've gone to college. You graduated college, obviously, with a degree for
hmm
electrical engineering. What
hmm
was your first job?
my first job when I moved out to Victoria. So when I was living when I was still living. After I finished college, I was still living with my parents. I moved out when I was working in construction, and then I moved back in with them when I went to college. And so I had a choice to make. I was like, um, I was working at the local pub, slinging beers and drinking all the time and stuff like that, and that was fun. But it's like I didn't see that as a future, right? So I
Mm.
moved out to Vancouver Island, lived in Victoria. My friend was out there, like I said, went out there. My first job was with an electrical company, actually, like that was the kind of, actually, you know what? I got 2 jobs, and one of the jobs was a job on the weekend. It was a part-time job. The other job, which is really the job that I was trained for, was as an electrical engineer from Monday to Friday, sometimes Saturday, for working for one of the best electrical companies in the city. And they had a lot of they had buildings going up all over the place. So I suddenly went from not having many prospects to like a week later, I know, like, I was just the kind of person where like put a resume in my hand, I hit the streets, I knock on doors, right? And so that's just who I am. And that's what we had to do back then as well. Like, we'd be scouring the newspaper for jobs, but if there was
Yeah.
nothing there, you were hitting the streets and knocking on doors. And so my second job on the weekends was working in one of the local pubs in Victoria, right? So the thing is, so I had a great mix. I had like, because I loved, I love pubs and restaurants and working in that atmosphere still. So during the week, I could do my electrical thing, and on the weekends, I was working in the pubs and just serving people alcohol and all that stuff. So it was really fun. I did that for like 4 or 5 years while I was doing my electrical thing as well. Gave me a bit of
Mm.
spending money too, a bit of extra spending money. But the
Yeah.
thing about the electrical work is that I had to do like 4 years for an apprenticeship before I finally got certified. Right? I mean, that's a lot of work because eventually when you get better at the job, they start trusting you more with like live power. And as you know, live power, if you're not careful with it, it has a pretty nasty bite. As I found out, I got
Yeah.
hit quite a few times with power, with a couple of near misses with some electrical accidents. We'll put it that way.
Mm.
You know, but I was, like when I look back at it, though, I mean, the work was hard. I was still crawling around in dirt and connecting live transformers up and working with a lot of tools and all those things. And here's the thing. I think like that kind of work was just amazing again for building discipline. I also was able to support myself because I had an apartment and everything. And I never once had to, ask my parents for money or anything. I always like supported myself. And the great thing about it is that I was just independent. Like that's just something that I always wanted was to have this life of like total independence. And I'd achieved that when I moved out west. So
Mm. So what turned you around and started looking at something different, i.e., your
mm,
writing? What was the
yeah, great
catalyst
question.
that started that off?
Well, first of all, let's see. Okay, so I moved to Japan in '98. I 98 or 90, yeah, '98. So I lived in Victoria for about 6 years. Now, how I got here was a bit of a different story. And I'll try to keep it short. But I kind of had like in Victoria too. Like I had a couple of different lives. During the week I was a hard worker. I went in, I did my job, got my paycheck, and on the weekends I partied really hard. Went to all the dance clubs and everything. Like my whole weekend was just consumed by that. I'd go back into work Monday to Friday, the weekend, and sometimes during the week, I'd be out like drinking and partying, and I just love that lifestyle. Like that just took me to a whole different level, right? Without getting into that. But eventually, I started to get really sick from the drinking, and I realized when I tried to stop it, I couldn't. So I ended up in recovery. Right. And recovery was my choice. Right. I wanted to quit. I couldn't do it. So I went to Alcoholics Anonymous and I went there for a good number of years, actually. And finally, with the help of like a lot of people, got my head straight. Right. So what happened is that somebody in the meetings one day gave me a self help book. It was like the big book for Alcoholics Anonymous. But after that, somebody had given me like a book by Tony Robbins or something. Right. So I ended up reading the book, and the book was called Awaken the Giant Within. And when I read the book, I started thinking about like, instead of having this life of like, chaos and like drinking all the time and doing all those things, like that was fun, but I was ready for something different. Like I just wanted to build something with my life instead of kind of tearing it down. Right. So I thought, I went through the book that he had given me and by the way, I still have the book to this day. It's this book here, right?
Ah.
Awakening Tony Robbins. I went through this book cover to cover, and I started to craft a destiny for myself by doing everything that Tony said to do, like create a vision board and put that up into your wall. So I did that, right? Write down your goals. So I did that. And when I did these things, I started having these ideas like, wow, like what if, what would happen if I got on a plane and just traveled to the other side of the world? And, what would happen if I started writing books again? Like I started challenging myself with, what if I did these things, like how different could my life be? So I actually had two things that I knew I had to do. And one was I had to write these books that I've always wanted to write, because being a writer was the one thing that, even though I had not written anything for a long time, since like maybe high school, I had never forgotten that I wanted to be a writer. The other thing is, I wanted to travel the world. I thought, because I've always like, I never really been anywhere. Here I was living in this like, I'd been living in Victoria for quite a while. I grew up in a small town. Now I was living in another small town. Something inside me just said, there's got to be more out there. There has to be. I started meeting people who had traveled overseas. They went to Thailand and Indonesia, and they went to, Japan, and like they were telling me stories about these places, and I thought, wow, like that sounds really cool. I wish I could do that too. But something inside me kind of like didn't really believe it was possible. But then I started to read more books actually. And then I think I read like Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And then after reading that book, I realized anything is possible. So literally turned my room into a one big vision board. I had pictures all over the walls of all the places I was going to visit, like London, Australia, and Tokyo, like Thailand, right? You name it. I just went all in, but I also made a decision. I said, I think it was back in probably like March of '97. I said, 1 year from now, I'm going to be on a plane going to Asia, and I'm going to go to Thailand. And I literally just decided where I was going to go, and that was it. And everything all my thoughts, all my energy, everything went into building that pathway. Now, I was still working as an electrician, and by this time I was certified. I was running jobs. To be honest, I wasn't crazy about the job, but I mean, it was a job, and it was very challenging. But when I decided that I was going to move to the other side of the world, I knew I was going to give it up because I didn't want to stay in that profession. Like it was good for what it was at the time, but I knew like there was just more out there that I wanted to experience. So what happened? Probably 4 months after I made that decision to move to the other side of the world, I ended up finding in the newspaper. I found an ad. And by the way, I don't read the newspaper, never have. My roommate brought the newspaper home one day. I opened it up to a random page, and right there was this job description that said, "Teach English in Japan. Apply now." Right, and I thought, "Oh, that's a great idea. Why not?" So I did. I sent a resume to this address that they had. I did a nice little cover letter, and a month later, I found myself in a big hotel in downtown Vancouver having an interview with a Japanese businessman who owned a business school here in Japan. And he said, "We're bringing 3 people over." He goes, we're interviewing dozens of people. So, you might not get the job. So don't be disappointed. But, and that was it. I had the interview. And they called me back a few days later. And then she said, "Thanks for the interview. We're really sorry, but, we chose 3 people and you were number 4, so maybe next time." Right. I thought, okay, no problem. That's not going to change my plans because I'm still going to Thailand. So, but anyway, what happened? I think the next day they called me back and they said, "Oh, the third guy quit. So you're in," and that was it. So you can call that destiny, I guess. But next thing I knew, several months later. So by the way, when I made the decision to get on a plane to go to Asia, I said like I had given myself a year, right? So I was going to come to Asia in March of '98. So it turns out that this company flew me to Japan, paid for everything, the flight, they got me here, set me up in a hotel, gave me a car. I had a job, I had cash in my hand. I doubled my salary by coming here, right? So I was no longer crawling around in like dirty construction sites with live power. Now I was sitting in bars, and not bars, but like coffee shops and companies. And I was going to all these places teaching English, probably working about 20 hours a week, making twice as much money. and, and I thought, I'm never leaving this, right? I thought like, I knew like within a few months, I was probably going to be staying there for a very long time. So yeah. But what actually ended up happening though is like, yeah, I did end up staying here, ended up getting married, ended up having a couple of kids and a few dogs, and I bought a house. But here's the thing: after teaching for about 10 years, I my thoughts started to I started getting a little bit restless, and I realized like there's something that's I haven't done yet that's still missing. And I realized what it was is like I still have to write the books. And that's what I did. I realized like I've got to do this. I've got to do this one thing. Like because that was like one of the things on my list. So I started putting ideas together. started putting an outline together. And then one day I just sat down and just, I think it was back in 2008. I just wrote material for like 3 years. I didn't stop. I ended up writing 3 or 4 books. Now, I love fiction, and I actually ended up like I did write a lot of fiction. But when I made the decision to, which path should I take, fiction or nonfiction, I went with the nonfiction route, just because self help, personal development books, my mentors, everything really, when I look at it, is like it kind of saved my life, right? So I felt like I owed it to, I don't know, the world to, write these books, or to myself, maybe just to write these books. And like all the knowledge that I learned, I was going to put it into a book and just put it out there. So I did. I packaged everything up, found an editor online, found the cover designer online. And then by the time I was ready to publish, I was looking for a publisher. And as it turns out, Amazon had just launched their self-publishing platform back in 2012. And I thought, okay, I can keep looking for a publisher, or I could have this, like, publish this myself in like a few weeks. And back then, with things like nobody really knew anything about self-publishing, so I just asked a few people who I knew had published books online, and they're like, yeah, I just did this, and this. So I did, and that was it. And I think, looking back, my plan was just to publish one, maybe a couple of books, and then I don't know what I was going to do after that. But thing is, I didn't stop. I just kept going with it. I kept getting more ideas for more books, and next thing I knew, like, a few years went by, and before I knew it, the impossible happened. I used to call my writing a hobby, right? I never thought of it as a business. So if somebody, like, in my business really was teaching business English. Like, I was running a business school at the time. And so what I would do is I would go to my full-time job in the daytime, and I would do the writing in the morning and late at night. Cause I had my kids were small at the time, and they were in kindergarten. So, we were busy parents, had a house to run, had a job to work at. So where do you find the time to do this stuff? You make the time, right? So on the weekends, early in the mornings, during, like, whenever I was at a coffee shop, always had my computer with me. I was always ready to work on my stuff when I had the time to do it. And that was just how I got through it. Probably goes back to those early days of just being super resilient and not giving up. Like, back when,
Yeah.
when and I think that, I don't know, it was an attitude, but I mean, that just carried, like, that's still inside me, like the drive. So I was always just tapping into that. And I think I may have learned a lot of that from, like, reading Tony Robbins' book and a lot of other books as well.
Mm.
But yeah, the books just started flowing, and so, by the way, and when I said the impossible happened, what happened is, my books started making more money than I was making in my regular job. And when that happened, I almost couldn't believe it, because I went from making, like, Amazon would send me like a few dollars, $10, and I'm like, great, I got money for coffee this month, and then the next month it'd be like $20, and then $50, and then I put out a really good book once. And when I say really good book, I meant, like, I just I had a good title for it. I think the material was good. People just seemed to really like it. And suddenly it went from like $50 a month to like a few thousand, and then it's like, wow, okay, now I've got money to do what exactly? Because I never had any money, because I had a family to support, and I had a mortgage, and I had a car to pay for. So suddenly I had extra money, which I started putting back into my book business, which started to, generate more books, actually. And so
Mm.
eventually I ended up getting working together with a publishing company, which I still work together with them to this day. And I do coaching all the time. I coach people on how to write books, not so much the writing process, but really, like, how to put their book together, how to market the book, and how to build the business from the book. So I've been coaching for years on people, like, coaching people how to do that process, as well as still working with a very aggressive publishing schedule to this day.
So that's already going really well then. So the question I've got there is, when did you make that jump from quitting the job of your business school to being a
Mm.
full-time writer?
Oh, that's a
What
good
was
one.
the
Yes.
point when that
Yeah, I
happened?
left that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I would say back in 20, so I left my full-time job back in 2019. And the thing is, like, I, I went back to Canada to visit my mother, and I don't remember exactly when it happened, but here's the thing: when I make a decision to do something, like I just do it. Like, I mean, it's the same way when it's like when I said I'm going to move to Japan, I just did it. Well, and it actually took me a year to get here. But the thing is, I did not change my mind about it, right? No matter what. So when it came time for me to leave my job, I remember, like, I realized one day, is like, you know what? I've had enough of this. Like, I'm done with this. Like, I just didn't want to do it anymore. And my book business and the coaching was going so well, I didn't have to, right? So I gave my notice. I think I gave like 3 months notice, and that was it. I just wrapped up my job, brought someone in to take over my position. And remember, this was pre-COVID, right? So this was back in 2019. So here's the thing. At the time, and don't get me wrong, it was the best decision that I had made in a very long time. And I certainly don't regret it when I look back on it now. But and I hear a lot of people talk about this, like leaving, they want to quit their job so they can become their own boss and work from home. Okay. That sounds really nice and sexy and everything like that. But the reality of it is, like, I was working in a full time position that took care of me, right? Like, they had medical and they had benefits and all this stuff, right? And, again, I still had a family to support and everything. And suddenly I was going to go from that to becoming the full-time author that I wanted to be, while I was, doing coaching and other things, right? And now the thing that I had not prepared myself, I wasn't ready to be honest, I wasn't ready for anything. Like, I just thought, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to go write books, right? And that was the plan. So in other words, I didn't have a plan, right? But I mean, I was still making some pretty good money with the writing and stuff like that. The thing is like, you can be up here one month and down here the next month, right? Whereas if you have a full-time job, you're just getting a constant paycheck, right? And I think anybody who's listening to this knows that, right? Right. So here's the thing. A year later, COVID hits, and well, we all know what happened with that. We all found ourselves locked up at home. And here's the thing: I went from working in an office with a bunch of people to, and by the way, I learned a really hard lesson. Like, I need to communicate with people on a regular basis. Even though I'm kind of an introvert, I'm really more of an extrovert in a sense, although I always thought of myself as an introvert. But I can only be introverted for so long, and then I need communication. I need human connection. Well, when I suddenly went from working in an office to now I'm working at home, working from my room, living in a room with, I had, like, my family had the rest of the house. I had like a little room upstairs with like three dogs. It's like so I'm building out this, like, I had this like dream to build out this like 7-figure, 8-figure publishing business and doing all these things. And I'm actually was actually doing it from this little room where I have like and when you're working online, people can't see what's happening in the background, but I mean, I'm coaching online, doing workshops, writing books. And the reality is, I'm like in this little room, kind of like at the time I was kind of like estranged from my wife and stuff like that. We actually ended up getting, separated later on and divorced and everything. But it's all good. We're all good and everybody's fine. But so I'm in this little room with like three dogs, a poodle and two of those little wiener dogs, the duck sounds. So they're like my support group, right? So anyway, okay, going forward a little bit, COVID hits in 2020, and I'm suddenly finding myself, like, just like a lot of people, isolated, right? Like, and it's suddenly, like, one day I just kind of had a bit of a meltdown where I realized, like, I felt like I'd made the biggest mistake of my life, was leaving my full-time job. So 2 or 3 months into COVID, I went back to the company that I quit a year and a half ago. And I said, "Hey guys, I haven't seen you for a while. Just dropping in to see how things are going." Well, of course, COVID hit everybody. Everyone's closed down, right? And these guys are no different. Like we don't have students coming into the school anymore. And my position had been replaced by somebody else. And to be honest, I just wanted them to say, "Oh, we'd love to have you come back." Of course they didn't, because I quit, right? You know, um, and I just remember, like, walking out of there that day thinking, that's it. Like, I'm done with publishing. I'm not, like, I almost gave up everything on that day. And went through the rest of the year kind of like in a little bit of a depressive state, but I pulled myself out of it in 2021. And when I did, we all started coming out of COVID around then too. We were still a little bit, things were still shut down and not back to normal, but I actually met somebody who became like a coach or a mentor, and he said like, he got me into meditation. He got me back into creating a vision board. He got me back into writing my goals out and stuff like that. I started finding new coaches online, like people who had podcast interviews, like Lewis Howes and Ed Millett, and like these people that were all associated with Tony Robbins. That they were like my crowd of people who I used to read all their books and spend, like, they really got me out of a really bad rut, right? Just watching their interviews and listening to their, like, reading their material. So I decided to get, I actually, like in 2020, I didn't publish one book. In fact, I unpublished more books than I published. And my book business went from like, five figures a month to zero, basically, like within a few months. So flatlined. And so it wasn't looking good, right? But I ended up coming up with an idea for a book, just on how I managed to deal with my chronic procrastination. And it's called "Do the Hard Things First" was the name of the book. Now I got four books in the series, but the first book was on how to overcome procrastination, and I just wrote it really for myself, right? And the book actually ended up, like, I published it, and like, it started taking off though. Like, people started kind of like, the title started getting around a little bit online, and people started sharing it online, and then I started getting offers from publishing companies overseas, like from India, Vietnam, Thailand, and they want to buy the rights to the book. And then Japan wanted to buy it, and it's like, wow, like, I was not expecting any of this, right? And so to this date, the book is now in, I think, 18 languages. The first book, anyway, is in 18 languages, and yeah, it's coming up on selling like 500,000 copies, maybe. So, but like, none of this was planned, right? I mean, all of it came out of an era where it's like, I just thought, like, I was ready to really give everything up. In fact, I think I had, but I thought, maybe I've just got one more shot at one more book, and I'll just do this one more book, and then I'm done. And I think probably if the book hadn't taken off, I probably would have been.
Mm.
But when it did, and it gave me back some, I was like, okay, well, I guess this is like, I got my second win back. So, and started putting more books out there, and started putting a lot more books out there. And then I went from calling and the thing is, right, I think what really was holding me back this whole time is, like, I never really took my book business seriously. I always referred to it as a hobby. Even when I was making decent money at it, it was still a hobby, right? But I mean, you can't call something a hobby if you're making more money at it than your regular job, right? But the thing is like, it was a mindset with me, and I had to change my mindset. And to this day, it's still hard sometimes, because I think there's kind of like a part of you that feels guilty when it's like, when you're doing something you'll actually love to do and you're making money at it. Like, back in when I was growing up, like, you didn't make money at your hobby, really. You made money at your job, right? So it's
Yeah.
really hard to merge those two things together. So, but here we are, years later. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've got one final question. Books, they're great for
Hmm.
people that are good readers. What
Hmm.
about for people that are not? Have you got any plans to do audiobooks? And are
Oh,
any of
we've
your
already got,
books
yeah,
available?
we've got audiobooks for everything. Yeah. No, great question. Yeah. So actually, when I first started, I only started doing ebooks, right? And then, and I wasn't even doing paperbacks, which made no sense, right? And I think part of it is just because I didn't know how to create a paperback. And then someone showed me, and it's like, oh, that's easy. So I started doing paperbacks like years ago. And then I did hardcovers, right? And I think back in probably 2018, maybe 2019, somebody said to me, we noticed, like, you've got all these books in the marketplace, but you don't have any audiobooks. So the truth is, I didn't want to record the book myself, right? Because first of all, I had some perfectionism. I just and trying to deal with like the tech, the audio tech and all this, and like I tried doing it a few times. It was just terrible, right? It's like, I'm never going to get this done. So what did I do? I ended up finding somebody, a professional recording artist who does audiobooks. I ended up paying him like $1,000 per audiobook, and he just, and I had a bit of cash for this, so I put some cash into it, and he just ended up doing all my books. And the thing is, his voice sounded very much like mine, right? So got the audiobooks out there. Now, I still outsource my audiobooks to other people who record them. I'm now working with AI software, like a lot of people are, to do the audiobooks. But yeah, we have audiobooks, hardcover, paperbacks, ebooks, and and the audiobooks also are. A lot of them are also in German, Spanish, and other languages as well. So the other thing too, just to add to your question, is I'm now working on courses from the books as well. So again, courses was something where I wish I'd started doing them sooner, but now that I've got all this content out there, it's like people are actually asking like, when are the courses coming out? We want to learn from your videos, and I'm like, oh, okay, shoot, I guess I better get that stuff together too. So now I'm still, I'm still publishing books, but I'm pulling back a little bit to spend more time with the course development. I mean, I can put a course together in probably just like a couple of weeks, right? But yeah, that is the next. The course platform is going to launch next month, so really excited to get it out there finally.
Mm.
And the reason why I'm doing podcast interviews is because, first of all, I love communicating with people, and meeting a lot of people online, of course, and just having great conversations about life in general. And this is actually one of the probably the only. I mean, like a lot of the other podcasts I've had in the like before, they were we were sometimes like very business focused or talking about the strategies from the book and things like that. So this is probably the only podcast where we actually went through like a lot of the life story, which I really enjoyed doing it because it made me remember a lot of the things that actually made me who I am today, which is something that we don't take a lot of time to really reflect on. So I think those are really good. It's a really good system, I think. So.
Mm. So what about the fiction side of it? Are you going to get some fiction written and published?
Absolutely, yeah. So back in the day when I got back into writing again, by the way, I was writing fiction. I had like stories all over the place. So I came up with a character, kind of like a Jack Reacher type character, where he's a real badass in the military world, and he's on the run from the CIA, and he's chases bad guys and all this stuff. So I've got these books. I got two of them actually. The rough drafts are finished. And what I did is when I started working on the nonfiction books, I just shelved everything. I shelved all my fiction stuff, right? I wrote another book based in World War II about submarines, right? So I've been on a submarine, not serving on a submarine, but I mean, when I went to Pearl Harbor years ago, I ended up going onto a World War II submarine where I got an idea for a book. And I actually asked myself, like, what would happen if this was like 1943, and I don't know, like the Germans had to, the Germans came up with some kind of a bomb, and they had to give it to the Japanese. And so I started coming up with this idea for a submarine story, put it together, and I think I call it Dark Depths or something like that. But I've got that story, so I'm going to publish these books, right? The thing is like I just got so busy with my personal development material and this whole platform. I wasn't really expecting it to keep going, So and it's not slowing down either, right? So I've got to bring some more people on board probably to help with that side of the business, so I can go over here and create the fiction books and get those out into the market. So
Mm.
yeah, but yeah, I still love coming up with stories. I still read fiction, not as much as I used to, but I know, and I'm still asking myself those questions that Stephen King used to ask himself, like, what if this happened, and that's how it all begins. So there will definitely be a series of fiction books coming out very soon. So
Terrific. Well, Scott, that's been fascinating. I've
yeah,
really
I had a
enjoyed
great conversation.
this.
Mm.
Really enjoyed learning about where you've come from and how you've got to where you are.
Well,
So,
I enjoyed
no,
talking about this. Yeah.
terrific. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's great to have me on the show, and I hope to see you again someday.
Absolutely. Well, there you go. What a great story. So, if you like it, give us the old thumbs up, put the comments in, and all the rest of it. So, until the next one, TTFN. Ta ta for now.